Okay, so what I want you to build for this weekend, and it's in a way a little bit of a mini version of what you've done in the workshop, which I think is good because you're going to be able to build it from scratch here. One of the things that you'll notice at this point, and you'll notice this in the workshop as well, is that there's no change of the URL. So there's no routing, which is something we'll end up getting into. But in my example here, I've got the ability to sort of switch between two tabs. Now, again, this was something that we covered by basically, keeping track in our state of which view that we're on, and we decide which components to render based upon our state. So this is a fairly simplistic one. When we get into products, it gets to be a little bit more complicated where we can end up deleting a product and we could end up adding a product. The adding of the product is something that we haven't really covered at all. You already know how to make the, back-end routes on that, which we'll talk about as well, but I'll go over how these forms are set up, even though we're not going to get to forms for a little bit of a while within Juke. The one thing that I sort of want you to think about, at least right off the bat, is the fact that we have a state, and there's really three things we're keeping track of in the state for this application. The view that we're on, the products, and the users. Okay? So we have this, this is not totally true, but in the end we have this sort of one sort of smart component which has a state, okay? And it's basically sending the props down, and the state ends up changing. So for instance, you could sort of think about the fact that, when the smart component loads, the state has a list of users and a list of products, but they're both empty. And then in our component did mount, we go and we get the users and we get the products, and we end up setting them to the state. And if we sort of look down at this list, the way that it's set up is underneath our smart component, which is our app, we've got our nav bar, okay? And our nav bar basically really has to know one thing. The other thing we're going to keep track of in the state is what our view is. So you can call this whatever you want to call it. I just used a string. I said, my view name is either going to be users or it's going to be products, okay? And I pass that as a prop to my nav so it knows which ones to highlight. The other thing that I end up passing to my nav is I also pass down, again, it's a dumb component, I also pass down to my nav, my users, and my products so I can show them up on the top, okay? The other thing is that since my nav, something interesting is going to be happening in my nav, I'm going to let the user change what page you're looking at. You can imagine that there is some function that you can pass down to your nav on view change or something along those lines that's going to end up going and having the state change its view, which is going to change which view ends up getting rendered. That's what I would sort of start out with. Get that working. Within the user list, it's pretty simplistic. The user list is pretty dumb. It gets past a list of users. Nothing interesting going on here, although you can always modify that if you wanted to. Products is a little bit more interesting because products has the ability to delete a user. So you can imagine this dumb component, we're passing down not only a list of products, but also some function to determine what to do when we go and delete a product, okay? And again, we're going to handle that up in our app. So when a product ends up going to get deleted, we can make a call to the back end and delete that product and then just change our state accordingly. By the way, if you want to go back and look at the introductory video for React, you can take a look at that. That'll show you really all the concepts that you need to know for this assignment, with the exception of the form. The form is a little bit more complicated. And that just generally forms are a little bit more work with React. I think that's why we saved them at the end, but I'm going to go into them as well. The thing with this is that there's another thing within this product list. Product list has a product form, and you can imagine one of the things that we're passing down is, on create product. So we pass that down to our app. It ends up getting passed to our product list. It ends up getting passed to our product form. And when this button gets clicked, we call it. We make a call to the server to post our data, and we end up updating our state. Again, it's all about the state that's changing. And we're going to keep things as simple as we can keep them by keeping our state, okay, really with just three things to worry about. The view that it's looking at, okay? We can say the name of the view that it's looking at. That might be an easier way to say it. The name of the view that it's looking at, a collection of products, and a collection of users, okay? So in terms of the routes that you have to set up, again, look, if you wanted to, you could choose another structure, but this is, I think, a natural fit for this. If you ended up doing anything, you could sort of think about the way that this is composed. You have your smart app, which is controlling your state. You have your nav, okay? You have your product list or your user list, which is going to be showing, okay? And again, your product list is a little bit more complicated because you have that form that's here. So the routes themselves that you're going to end up creating, we've got an API for products. We've got an API for users. We've got a delete for API products and an ID and a post. Now again, those server-side routes operate outside of React. Those would be the same way you would end up setting up your routes before, okay? You can sort of build those out if you want to and then get React working as well. The other thing that I did, I would rather that you didn't use this, but I set it up anyway because, frankly, I just got tired of creating things from scratch all the time. So, and I want to use this to just demo something really quick. So this is a repo that I put up today. It's my React template, and I'm going to do git.clone. Git.clone, and I'll take this, and I'm just going to call this weekend demo. And I'll go into this, and I'm going to do an npm install. So I only did this because this actually has all the sort of moving parts that you need. But again, it's not a big deal. I'd rather you go in and do something like this from scratch at least a couple of times until you're pretty comfortable doing it. If I end up opening this up, and taking a look at it, so this doesn't have anything that's sort of crazy complicated. It's got our web config. It's got our server. I've got a route for vendor. I've got a route for dist. I've got a router for all of my API calls. If I look at my routes, again, in a more complicated app, you would have your routes in a separate routes folder, but this is just sort of bare bones. Again, if you've created apps a few times on your own, you can start taking a look at this if you want to. But again, when you're creating things on your own, you're going to come up with something sort of similar to this. This is our, these were our routes. If we went to look at our models, I put all of this in one file. In a real application, with anything sort of more than this, we have 3 files here. We have one for our connection object, we have one for our index, and we would set up our product model separately. So I'm just seeding a little bit of data here. Again, this is my common pattern. My index.html file is pretty simplistic. I've got my bundle, I'm deferring it. I've got my root, I put my bootstrap in here. And if I go over here and I say npm run start dev, and I go back over here and I load this. I just have the number 42 showing, and just to show where that's coming from, real simple. I just have my index file. A couple of things that I'm showing you here is that, and again, this pattern is something that might not be that common to you, but you'll see it in the workshops. You know, React has a number of different things that it exports, okay? The default thing that it exports is React, right? So that's why you see React without the braces up there. And when you see the component, what that says is, hey, look, I also want to bring in component from the React library. I don't have to do that. I can just use React and say React.component, but it's kind of explicit as to what I'm bringing in here. On the same token, React DOM, instead of actually bringing React DOM in there, I only need the render method from React DOM, so I end up bringing that in. Okay? This is something you don't have to do. You could bring in React DOM and render it. This is probably about as simple as you could get for a smart component. I'm rendering out my app. Again, this is JSX behind the scenes, right? This is going to be React is going to do a create element and turn this into regular JavaScript. But this app, pretty simple. I have a constructor here. Again, I did this because your main app is probably, your entry point is probably going to be a smart component. So again, this app extends component. I call super, and I'm basically passing in a special number, which is 42, and that's what I end up outputting. Okay? What I want to show you is how to deal with forms in an app. Okay? So I'm going to do two things here, really simply. You know, one of them being that if I wanted to do something like this dot state equals, and I'm going to say, what did we do? We did users and products, right? So I'll go over here and I'll say products is an empty array. So just for the sake of argument, I'm going to go over here and say this dot state dot products dot length, right? And we would expect that to be 0, right? State is set to 0. This reloads. I go back here. Product is not defined. I probably typed something wrong. Not product, but products. This dot state, and this is wrong. This is an object. I don't know what I'm thinking here. Okay. So now I've got the state set, and this is going to tell me 420. Let's take out the, by the way, I told you this before. This is a little weird. If you want to get a space, you do that. Sometimes that's helpful when you just want to get a little space there. So if I do that, I see 42 and 0. Okay. But I actually have Axios in here ready. So I used it before. So if I import Axios from Axios, and I use the lifecycle method component did mount. Now I could say axios.get / API / products.
That's how you get the Axios is what you use to interface with your backend.
Yeah, my Axios is basically going to allow me to make AJAX calls to the backend. Right, it's all wrapped. It's like the $sign jQuery AJAX. It's just a lot friendlier to use. So if we go over here and I end up doing a then, right, I get a response. I'm going to use my response.data. And if I go over here and I do a then, this is going to give me my products. And now I could say this set state products. And again, the thing is that when the state ends up changing, okay, this is when React says, hey, look, let me look at what I think the DOM is supposed to be, and let me look at what it is, and if it's different, I'm going to make whatever changes I need to make, in which case this goes from 42 to 3 because we've got 3 products that are in our database, okay? Again, if you wanted to, you could always go over here and do a map and loop over your products. That's something you could always take a look at. What I want to do here is I want to create a my form, because this is what you're going to do that's similar with the product form. So if I end up doing my form, if I just did this, and I went back and I reloaded it, I would see my form is not defined. Now, I could come in here and do my form as I could go over here and do my form, and do something like this. Doesn't make a lot of sense. That's actually slightly incorrect. My form equals, right? Because again, what React is going to do is React is going to go and say, if you end up doing this, right? It's going to basically use this as your class, as your component. And if I ended up doing that, then what's going to happen is that I'll get a string in here that says hello. Not terribly exciting. What I want to get at here is that what I really want to do is I want to have an input field here with a button. The problem is that when React looks at an input field, literally you can't really change anything. You're changing the UI, okay? So whenever you have a form or an input field, although there are some other ways to do it, one of the ways to do it is to actually do a smart component that has some state. Let me show you what I mean here. So instead of actually using this component, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say class my form extends component. And as you get some more familiarity with this, what's the problem that you're going to run into now if I ended up running this? What's the error? It doesn't know how to render. I don't know what to do here. I don't know how to render. And let's go over here and let's actually put in a render. And we'll pass back a, let's say, a div. And we'll go over here, put another div. I'm going to give this a class name of form group. Put this in another div as well. So if I go over here and I do something like input class name is going to be form control. And I do that, and I forget to do this, right? I can't just put in render. I have to return something from this. And if I do that, I should get this input field, okay? And that's fine. That works okay. And I could type it in, but I really need to get access to this data. So, one thing that I can do here is that once I end up, let me show you the issue here. Once I end up giving this a value of something, it no longer lets me change it, okay? So what you have to do here is that I'm going to use my constructor. Once you use your constructor, you have to call super. Not passing anything in here for the moment. But if I went over here, I could say this dot state, and you could really call this whatever you want to call it. I'm going to call this, I'll say the name is equal to an empty string. And when I go here for my value, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say name. Okay. Now, if I do that, I'm going to be in the exact same boat that I was before, not being able to change anything. But just so you could see, and this is actually slightly incorrect. Yes, you're right. This dot state dot name. Thank you. Okay. But even then, I'm going to be in the same boat that I was in before. But just to show you that it's using the state, if I do that, and it's actually even telling me some information here. Once I end up doing that, it's saying, hey, look, you got a little problem because if you're going to do this, your thing is going to stay exactly the way it is unless you deal with an on-change handler. So the same way that a button has an on-click handler, what we can do is we could go over here and say onChange. And let's pretend that we have multiple fields here, which we don't. I'm going to say this is equal to this OnNameChange. And the way that I'm going to end up doing that is that if I go over here and I say OnNameChange, and I'm just going to console.log for a moment this. Okay? So now I've got an OnNameChange here. And if I do console.log and I try to press something, notice that error, right? What does that always tell you when you get that? You got a little binding to do, right? Very, very common pattern. So we'll say this OnNameChange equals this OnNameChange, and we're going to bind it to this. And now, if we go back here, try that one more time. Now we'll see that we have our object. So just for the sake of argument, if I went back over here and I said this dot set state name is equal to foo, doesn't make a lot of sense. But if I did that, I'm going to start at ABC, and every time I go to type, and I think it's just a little delayed here, every time I go to type, I'm going to be left with foo, and it ain't never going to change again. Right? So what actually happens, kind of interesting, is that you know, these actually turn into regular DOM events. And if you remember, one of the things that you might not know, but with regular DOM events, what end up getting passed to these callback functions are going to be what's called an event. And it's an event argument. And so there's one thing you can do with the event, and it has a bunch of information in it. It's got what the target is, which would be the text box, because that's where the event came from. It also has things like X and Y coordinates, what you ended up clicking on. It's how they end up doing some bunch of drag and drop stuff, I imagine. But if I go over here and I say, well, really what I want the name to be, I'm going to take the event. I'm going to look at the target. The target is actually going to be the text box, because that's what I put this onChange on. And I'm going to use whatever its value is. So what's going to happen is that every time that I change here, right, it's actually doing a re-render because the state is changing. If I was to go over here and do console.log, rendering, and I did this, I would see that I could see that I'm rendering, you know, a bunch of times. Again, there's other alternatives for doing something like this, but it does the same thing. So again, when you end up going to create your form, you just want to make sure that you end up following this pattern. Let me just show one more thing here that we could do, just to beat a dead horse a little bit. Let's say that we go over here. I'm going to pass to my form, and I'm going to call it OnNumberChange. OnNumberChange. Let's call it OnNameChange. Let's actually be more specific. We'll say OnNameSave. And let's pretend that we have a this OnNameSave. Again, we've done this a couple of times already, so we're going to put in a OnNameSave, which is going to be this function. And let's just pretend, for the sake of argument, the only thing we're going to pass in here is going to be a name. And what I want to do is to say, hey, look, we've got our special number that we're outputting here. Let's modify this and say this dot state special number. And we'll go over here and say products is products. And we'll say special number is going to be props dot special number. So what's going to happen here is that when we do OnNameChange, let's just say that, hey, look, what we want to see that something happened. So we'll say this set state and we're going to set our special number to whatever the user ended up doing with the name. Okay. Right now, nothing should be broken here. I don't think we're doing anything with OnNameChange, so nothing should really happen. But what I want to do is go back over here and put in a button and do an onClick and say, hey, look, when this ends up getting clicked, what I want to do is I want to call this function. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call OnNameSave. And what I'm going to pass to it, what I'm going to end up passing to it is going to be, again, it's my state that I'm keeping track of here. I'll pass to it this.state.name. Okay? So again, the thing to sort of think about here is that if this is being passed in here, what I can do is I could specify, hey, look, I'm going to say this on name save is equal to, and don't forget we have props that get passed in here. So I'm going to pass these props on name save.
So you have to bind the OnNameSave in your main component. No, in your app.
Yeah, I see that. Maybe. Let's see. Let's just, for starters, say that we're going to do this. Let's just see if this works. So one thing that's going to happen here is that I've got my OnNameSave. No, let's rename this. This is silly. Let's call it OnSave. Better. Props OnSave. And we'll say OnSave. And when we go over here, let's again just keep this a little simpler. We'll call OnSave. And when we create this form, we'll pass in OnSave, OnSave. And when we go up here, OnSave, we'll end up setting our state. We just have to make sure that we end up binding this, right? This OnSave equals this OnSave bind to this. Let's just see what happens here. One thing that I like to do pretty often, just to make sure that my function ended up getting passed, is, do a console.log props OnSave, just so I could see that it got passed. So I could see that this function ended up getting passed. If I do this, you can see that it's actually changing my special number here. Okay? So the point that I'm getting at here, and if you want it to be even a little bit more explicit, props gets passed, so you could catch OnSave. And you could basically just say this OnSave equals whatever OnSave is. And now we're calling this OnSave, and we're using the name of the state. So if I want to change my number to 44, I could do that. When I click save, it'll end up getting passed up. And that's pretty much what you're doing with this, where you have a form. When the user ends up clicking on save, we basically pass that value up. You make an Axios call to the server to end up posting that object. Yeah, and then make sure you update your state accordingly. By the way, this is not perfect, because if I go over here and do this, what I'm doing with my state, I'm basically saying, I'm being very optimistic, and I'm saying, hey, look, go up to the server, add this thing, and just add it to my list of products. But actually, when I do a call at the beginning, when I load this, I actually sort these by alphabetical order. so you can see how the order changes. Not perfect, but good enough. So again, my whole take here is two really different things. Passing in functions, passing around functions, you've done that before, right? I think you've done it, I think it's in the workshop a bunch of times. So again, if you have something that you're composing here and something interesting is happening here, then make sure that you end up passing a function in. And if you pass a function in, make sure you set the binding correctly. And again, the key here is also to just go and build this out a little bit at a time. In which case, when this button gets clicked on, we've got this thing that we passed in here, and we end up calling this. Okay? The big part that's a little bit trickier is the whole idea that you have this idea of when your UI ends up changing and you want to keep track of it, you're sort of forced to do a smarter component than you think you might need. But the reason why that's happening is that this UI is changing, and as a result of that state changing, it needs to re-render. And again, if you just end up taking a look at this model, and this is something else, something I could save up, you could actually use this as a bit of a template. All right, let me stop this recording.